meta-musical evening. I'm very happy to share the stage with mathematician Raf Bocklandt, with whom I collaborated on the Etudes that you will hear on the second half of this program. I will start with a program devoted to rhythm and counterpoint. Then a talk about symmetry by Raf will follow, where we'll focus especially on Lie theory. Then we'll have a break. And after the break, I will play the Etudes, the SO3 Etudes, on the mathematical framework of which I collaborated with Raf, as I said before. And at the end, we will have a dialogue where we will talk about how our collaboration came about, and we will discuss the Etudes a bit more. So now I will keep on playing. So enjoy this evening. And
So now, okay, so now I'm going to tell you a short story of symmetry. And to tell this story, we have to go back 150 years ago to Paris. Paris, 1870, was a very interesting city at that time. Paris was making its transition from, well, maybe not a medieval city, but from a city with slums to a modern city with broad boulevards as we now know it. The Eiffel Tower was not there yet, but you could see the city taking shape, the shape as we know it now. So it was a very interesting city to be in, not just for for arts and culture, but also for mathematics. And in this city, we meet two friends, and you see here, Sophus Lie was a Norwegian mathematician. He was a young student at that time, and he was visiting Paris, and he met with Felix Klein. He was a German mathematician, was also a young, and they were both making tours around Europe to visit the mathematical centers of that day. And they had met before in Berlin, and now they were meeting each other again in Paris. And they were very excited to meet each other again, because they, in Berlin, they had to make contact, and they had a lot of discussions, and they were eager to discuss further mathematics. At that time, they were in their mid-20s, early 20s actually, and probably they hadn't had these big beards yet, but they were young students at that time. And so, what were they talking about? Well, mathematics was also becoming was changing a lot. Just like Paris, mathematics was changing a lot. There were, especially in the field of geometry. So before the 1850s, there was only one type of geometry, and it was the classical Greek Euclidean geometry. And suddenly, a lot of new geometries popped up. And they were like curved geometries and non-Euclidean geometries, as they call it, new geometries that behaved different, and sometimes they behaved similar, sometimes they behaved in a bit strange way, sometimes completely crazy, and there were so many new things appearing that it was not clear how this would all fit together. And so Sophus Lie and Felix Klein, they were very excited about that. They were really interested into geometry, and in the late evenings when they would sit together in Paris in their student rooms, they would discuss, well, how can we make sense of all these geometries? What is the secret thing that ties them together? And Paris was the perfect place to discuss this, because Paris was also the home of a new type of mathematics that could really give the answer to this. And this, the whole secret, the whole mathematics that was responsible for this was the study of symmetry. And so symmetry and the study of symmetry, as we know it now, group theory in mathematics, was originated in Paris 40 years before. In 1830, there was this really very young guy, Galois. He was 19 years old, and he discovered a new branch of mathematics, group theory, and it studied symmetries. He was studying equations, and he looked at symmetries of equations, and he discovered a new way to describe this. And this was using groups, and Galois was really excited about it, and he wrote it down, but unfortunately he was also in love with a beautiful French girl, and he had a rival, and we don't know exactly how it happened, but he ended up in a duel, and a real duel with pistols, and unfortunately he got shot and died 19 years old. And at first his mathematics, because it was so revolutionary, it was not really well received, and people didn't understand it very well. But 40 years later, people started to appreciate what he had done, and it became really a hot topic. And so in Paris, group theory at that time in 1870 was the hot point of discussion. And so Felix Klein and Sophus Lee, they heard about all this, and they were also fascinated by this. And so they were studying different types of symmetries, and Klein said to Sophus Lee, well, we should use symmetries to study geometry. Symmetry is the secret sauce that makes geometry tie together. And there are different types of symmetries, and one of the big differences is between discrete and continuous symmetry. So I have here an example. Well, this is a kind of the easiest symmetric thing that we all know. It's a triangle, a regular triangle, and so it has 6 symmetries. So you can flip like this in 3 different ways. You can do it like this, and you can do it like this, and then you can rotate like this, or rotate in the other direction. And then you can also do nothing. Mathematicians think of doing nothing also as a symmetry. So there's 6 symmetries, and there's not more. If you try to do something else, like rotating 60 degrees, then your triangle will not be in the same place as before. So that's not called a symmetry. But there are other objects that have an infinite number of symmetries. And the standard example is the sphere. So here I have a little globe, and you see, well, there are a lot of rotations that I can do. I can rotate around this axis over whatever degree I want. I can rotate it 1 degree, 2 degrees, 360 degrees all around. But I can also choose a different axis and then try to rotate like that. So there are actually an infinite number of symmetries here. So there's a whole lot of symmetries to study. And studying this infinite, so this is an infinite number of symmetries, but it's not just, well, saying it's just infinite is, well, mathematicians are not satisfied with that. You have to say a bit more than, oh, it's just an infinite number. You want to look at the structure, how all these symmetries interact. And Klein and Lee, they were discussing this, how can we study these infinite symmetries? And they were thinking about different approaches, but then something unfortunate happened. So 1870 was not just an ordinary year, it was actually a very violent year because a war broke out. So France and Germany, well, Germany, I should better say Prussia. Prussia at the time was the new rising power, and France and Prussia had, a war started between them, and suddenly a war broke out, and Felix Klein, who was German, and he was living in Paris, well, he had a big problem. He had to go back to Germany as fast as he could. So he left to Germany, and Sophus Lee, he was left without a soulmate in Paris, and he thought, well, what's the point of staying in Paris now? I'm going to the south, I'm going to Italy, there are also geometers in Italy. And so he said to himself, I'm traveling to Italy, and he was a Norwegian guy who liked hiking, and so he thought, well, why not go from Paris to Italy on foot? And so he started out in Paris, and he walked down in the countryside, but yeah, all these French people thought, well, who is this big beardy blonde guy walking around in the forest? He must be a German spy. And so only 20 kilometers south of Paris, Sophus Lee got arrested and put in jail as a spy. And they looked into his possessions, and they saw all these mathematical scribbles, and they said, yeah, this is definitely secret code, so he must be a German spy. And so Lee was in jail, but luckily his French colleagues found out that he was arrested, and with the help of some of the French mathematicians, he was set free and he could continue his journey. Well, but then he took the train to be on the safe side. So he went to Italy, stayed there a couple of months, and then returned to Norway and started to study this. Had this big project on symmetry. He said to himself, I'm going to study these infinite symmetries. And so the idea is, well, if something is infinite, well, it's not just infinite. You can sometimes say a bit more about, well, most things that are infinite, well, they have more structure. It's not just an infinite number of things, but they form kind of a space. Like, think of colors. Colors, well, there are an infinite variety of different types of color, whether you have more blue, more red, and so on. And you can make a color cube, so you can make a space of colors, and it's a three-dimensional space. So there are three directions in when you can change your color. You can make it more green, you can make it more red, or make it more blue. So you have a three-dimensional cube of colors. And similarly, Lee thought to himself, well, in the same way, you can have a space of all the symmetries. So in the case of the sphere, you can look at all the symmetries of the sphere, all these different rotations, and they will also form something similar as this color cube. So something like that. And so if you think about it, the space of rotations of a sphere is also three-dimensional, because you have to fix three things. You have the angle of rotation, but you also have the axis. And for the axis, you can say, well, the latitude and the longitude of the pole where you rotate about has two numbers. So you have two numbers, latitude and longitude, and then the angle of rotation gives you the third number. So colors, so just like color space, rotation space looks a bit like this. And this rotation space has a name, and it's called SO3. So it's the space of rotations in three dimensions. But this picture is a little bit deceiving. So it's actually not really a cube, because, well, if you rotate something around 0 degrees, it doesn't matter whether you rotate it around this axis 0 degrees or around that axis. So some of these points at the end of the cube, they represent the same thing. And if you think a bit more about it, then it's maybe a bit more like this. So you have a direction for the rotation, and then you make the radius outside to correspond to the angle of rotation. So it's a bit like a thick sphere. But then it's also not completely correct, because if you rotate 180 degrees like this, it's the same as if you wrote 180 degrees like that. So basically, these 2 points at the end of the red, correspond to the same. So in a way, you should kind of take the peel of the orange and identify it and glue it together, and you get a really, really complicated thing. And it's a bit complicated, and so Lee thought, well, maybe instead of looking in detail at the complicated thing, maybe we should first do something more simple. And so what Lee thought, well, what I do is I take my magnifying glass and I'm going to look in detail what happens in the center of the ball, and try to look at, well, in the center of the ball, what happens is that your rotations are very, very small. So he looks at very, very small rotations, and that makes it easier to handle because it's all very small, things do not wiggle much, and maybe looking at it in detail can tell you a lot about the rest. And so he thought maybe I should start studying the small thing before moving on to the big complicated thing. And that was his main idea. Now what are... So what are very small rotations? Well, how can you represent them? Well, if you, instead of rotating, if you do it very small, you just have a little arrow in which you are rotating. So instead of representing a full rotation, you just point to the direction in which you're rotating. And so you see, there are a couple of examples of small rotations. So for instance, if you rotate your sphere like this, then you get arrows that point downwards. If you rotate around this axis, you have arrows that go around that. And if you rotate like this, then it goes like this. And by studying the relations between all these small symmetries, Lee was able to kind of classify how symmetry behaves on the microscopic level. And that was his main breakthrough. His idea was to study symmetry, you first have to study symmetry at the microscopic level. And that actually is the whole basic idea of Lie theory, what we call. So it's a bit, you can also compare it a bit to, well, these infinitesimal symmetries, what do they correspond? Well, it's a bit the kind of the ways you can move in the space of symmetries. And so in the space of rotations, think of a plane, there are actually three types of things you can do. You can roll, you can yaw, and you can pitch. And these three, how they interact, this enables you to make all possible flights of this plane. So all symmetries, all rotations can be made by combining these three things. And so actually it's a bit, you can compare it. So if you want to study small symmetries, it's a bit like a game controller. You have a couple of buttons that you can press, and with these buttons, then you can move through the whole space. And the question is, what is a good controller? And Lee thought about, well, what kind of buttons must this controller have? Can I have some nice buttons that make symmetry behave in a uniform way? And all these ideas of finding the right buttons, well, what we call nice bases in mathematics, enables you to study this very much in detail and give you a complete classification. So it's a bit like trying out all kinds of different controllers to to play a game, and then picking out the nicest controller that enables you to cruise through space. And so this led to a whole theory, the theory of Lie groups and Lie algebras, and that now permeates the whole of mathematics actually. But of course, this was only the first part of the project. Looking at the small case is important, but then you have to go back to the whole space, and so you have to kind of curve this controller or this flat space, the directions you can go into the big curved space, and this is done using what they call an exponential map. And by studying how the small thing and the big thing come together, you can get a full description of what kind of symmetries there are. And so this led to a whole new field that is studied till to this day. Everybody who wants to do geometry or fundamental physics has to study Lie's theory. And you can see this by, if you go to a mathematics library, you can see lots and lots and lots of books about Lie groups, Lie algebras, and so on. And so it's a basic tool for mathematicians these days, so it's a very, very important subject. So, and it all started in a small room in Paris where two young mathematicians discussed together what is symmetry. And this led to this whole new field. Okay, this was what I wanted to tell to you today. And now, there's a break? Yeah. Okay. Okay.